Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel where we are serving up another tasty Marvel Contest of Champions video. Today, I'm doing something a bit different than normal. So I've had this idea for an Anti-Venom champion concept rolling around in my head for several months now, maybe a year actually. And it came up in my Alliance chat earlier this week. So I figured it was as good a time as any to kind of just put it out there, see what people think about it. I enjoy reading champion concepts that people put out on the Reddit. And there are a few on Twitter this past week that I really enjoyed looking at. So Anti-Venom is one of the characters that I would most like to see come to the game. And I hope I did him a bit of justice here. So the overall idea behind my concept is that Anti-Venom is a per-fight ramp-up champion with a focus on offense. I designed him by more or less taking what I liked out of Venom, out of Carnage, and Venom the Duck, who is my boy. Like any cosmic champion, he is heavily reliant on buffs. One of my biggest goals with this design was to kind of keep his abilities simple to understand, easy to use in a fight. Champion ability text these days seems to just be getting longer and more complicated, and I really wanted to avoid that, so I tried to keep it as concise as possible. So in terms of immunities, Anti-Venom is immune to both Incinerate and Poison. I tried to keep this in line with in the comics, and I know that he's vulnerable to a specific kind of poison in the comics, but in general, the symbiote is kind of able to filter out everything else from the host, things like radiation, toxic gas, things like that. I also added immunity to reverse controls, as this is still an ability that I think too few champs in the game possess right now. Especially with it being such a big part of the Grandmaster fight, I felt that adding a new champion who could counter that ability would fit well. So Anti-Venom's persistent charges are really the core of his mechanic. Since the symbiote itself is mindless, the host essentially has total control over it, and I wanted that reflected in his abilities. So at the end of every fight, Anti-Venom will generate and persist a buff based on the type of attack that he ended the fight with. And then at the start of every subsequent fight, all persisted buffs are then activated. So functionally, he can control his buffs similar to Carnage, but he can also save them from fight to fight like Venom the Duck does. Alright, so there are 6 types of attacks, and so 6 types of buffs that Anti-Venom can gain per fight. Medium and light, you get the physical resistance and armor ups. So this is to discourage kind of just ending the fight with an easy attack. Obviously, the better buffs are later on. So heavy power gain, precision, cruelty for the first 2 specials, and then you get a nice fury if you finish the fight with an SP3. So these buffs last for the duration of the entire quest, and he can hold a maximum of 6. I really went back and forth on that maximum number there. I decided to keep the number lower and balance it by not decreasing their potency if you were to activate duplicates of any of the buffs I listed there. And then just as a little safety net, if these buffs are removed for any other reason other than his abilities, they will reactivate after 10 seconds. So then that's a mechanic that I think we've seen recently in champs like Warlock and Guillotine with those armor ups, or if they go away, they will reactivate on their own. So similar to Venom, Anti-Venom also has a way to purge all of his buffs and essentially just reset himself. With Venom, you fire off that SP2, they're converted into Fury, and then you can kind of start over. For Anti-Venom, this would happen via his pre-fight ability. So before any fight, Anti-Venom can choose to consume all of his persistent charges, and at the start of that fight he receives a regen buff that increases in potency or duration the more charges that were consumed. And then while he has that regeneration buff active, he is also indestructible. So a little bit to unpack here. The indestructibility is kind of key because it activates immediately, so this will kind of allow him to mitigate or even negate damage at the start of a fight. So, things like the shock node or the bleed from the Double Edge Mastery. Functionally, think of it kind of like Captain Marvel activating Binary, but without the massive mega damage increase. And then under critical hits, this was really just to kind of give him some extra oomph in situations where you're trying to ramp him up, or you just purged your buffs and you don't want to lose, the entirety of your damage. So I gave him just some basic bleed damage. It's not as good as regular Venom's bleed, but it's decent, I think. All right, so moving on to his signature ability, which I've called Clintar Adaptation. So the first part is an increase in the potency of his buff, sort of, but not quite like Hyperion. And then as a bonus, if you can pull off all 6 attack types in a single fight, you are granted a Clintar buff, which negates the evade chance of all Spider-Verse champs. So again, similar to an ability that only Venom possesses right now. And then this Clintar buff will be persisted automatically as long as you have charges to spare. So moving on to Synergies. The first is with Venom. So Venom gets an increased chance to gain Fury. If you play Venom frequently, you know that it's kind of a crapshoot waiting for buffs. You can instantly reset a buff, but you only get a limited time to reset a buff before it's made permanent. And I think most people, the more Fury, the better. So I think that helps him a lot. And then for Anti-Venom, if you're at 0 persistent charges, you will randomly generate one of his buffs at the start of a fight. So this helps at the beginning of a quest when you are trying to ramp him up faster. And also, if you purge your buffs, you'll start the next fight with the regen and then another buff chosen at random. So this would also allow you to purge a buff every fight after the first fight if you so desired. So you could keep getting that short duration of indestructibility, but you would be essentially unable to ramp up your damage. So there's that balance there. So the second synergy is with Agent Venom, and it gives him something that I think is sorely lacking, and that is more consistent tenacity. So a flat 15% increase brings the tenacity up to 85%. It's still not 100. I think 100% would be a bit broken, but 85% is still pretty good and definitely way better than what it is right now. And then on the other side of this, all symbiote champions would gain increased attack against Spider-Verse champs and then fellow symbiotes. So a little useful there. Next synergy is with Carnage, and this gives him an increased chance to refresh his bleeds. This has been probably my biggest issue with playing Carnage since he got reworked. I think a small increase to the refresh chance would go a long way. And this synergy has probably the biggest benefit for Anti-Venom, because if you land all 6 attacks twice, either during the same fight or in 2 separate fights during a quest, the second Clintar buff combines with the first one into true accuracy. So this gives Anti-Venom the ability to negate not just the evade chance from Spider-Verse champs, but the evades and auto block actually with that for every champ, which is useful. So in especially in a mode like Act 6 where there is a fairly large health pool, you would definitely be able to get that true accuracy buff in your first fight, I think. And then you would be set for the rest of the path. And then finally, my boy Venom the Duck gets some love with this synergy. So if you've played Venom the Duck before, you know that he has this passive degen that he procs against bleed immune champs. But the potency, I think, is a bit lower than his bleeds. I think it's like 40% lower, I want to say. So this synergy just kind of ups that damage a little bit. It doesn't recoup the entirety of the decrease in potency, but it's decent enough, I think. And then for Anti-Venom, I would give him an additional persistent charge to be able to store another buff for the duration of the quest. So Anti-Venom's overall strengths, I think, are his versatility. So you have control over what buffs you get, control over when you can heal. I also think that he'd be really good for incursions. So some of the hacks that are in incursions, they really favor him as a champ with not only several buffs, but several unique buffs. And he has some decent immunities. Incursions are a mode where you wouldn't be afraid to dump his buffs, heal up, and then reset yourself for the next room. Especially at the end of a room where you're trying to decide between choosing the boss hack or healing your team for 40% of their health. he would kind of make that decision a bit easier for you, I think. So like most Cosmic Champs, I think Anti-Venom's weakness is that he is just heavily reliant on his buffs. So any champions or nodes that would mess with them would probably render him close to useless, and that's fine. Every champion needs weaknesses. Also, similar to like Morningstar, who was one of my favorite champions, he does require several fights to ramp up and reach that maximum damage potential. So might not be as useful in those early fights. In shorter quests, he might not even be able to reach that maximum potential depending on how long the path is. So finally, I wrote down some other things that I considered like adding. The first was some sort of resistance to like power control from tech champs. I think in the last like 6 to 8 months, the champions that have come out have really doubled down on the concept of class advantage and class disadvantage. So Anti-Venom as a Cosmic Champ would be at a distinct disadvantage against Mystics who can who can nullify his buffs. I wanted to maybe give him something to give him an advantage over tech champs. So what I considered was something like, if an effect would occur, like if he were to be power drained or power burned, that effect would not occur, and he would maybe become enraged and gain like a passive power gain instead or something like that. I also considered adding another immunity, but when I checked the chart from Trucos, I noticed that there is no other Cosmic Champ who has both Poison and Incinerate immunity. So, he already has the reverse controls as well, so kind of adding that another immunity seemed like a bit too much. And then I also considered adding an armor break for bleed immune champs, but that would basically be lifting an ability straight from Carnage, so I kind of threw out that idea. Overall, I kind of envision Anti-Venom as like a glass cannon type champ. I want him to have good block proficiency, but maybe a below average health pool to compensate for the damage and his ability to regen. I feel like ramped up and at a high sig, he would probably put in some nice damage, and I definitely wanted to balance that out on the back end. And then my last note here is kind of something I asked myself over and over while I was doing this. I'm not a champion designer, obviously. They put in a lot more time and effort into real champions than I did here. But I think this process showed me how difficult it must be to balance a real champion in this game. And beyond that, how easily a champion can kind of slip into, beyond God tier range, even by accident. Anti-Venom isn't even a real champ, but I found myself, sitting here thinking, are people going to think that's too much? Is he too boring? Is he broken in certain matchups? And it really made me wonder how many of the God tier champions that we have in the game right now were actually intended to be that powerful, or were they just kind of accidentally good? So it'd be a question I would love to ask. I've been a software developer myself for 15 years now, and I'd like to think that I tend to look at things in this game from that kind of perspective. So when it comes to effectively balancing a champion's design, the developer in me has difficulty wrapping my head around the testing aspect of it. How does one test a new champ against the seemingly infinite node and mechanic combinations? How much automated testing can really occur in an application that relies heavily on precise user input? Kabam often faces criticism for things like, fixing unintended interactions is a popular phrase. But I think that if you take the number of hours a QA team of, let's say, 5 people can possibly spend testing a champion within a 4-week development cycle, and compare that number to the total man hours the community spends playing a new champion on day 1, it's easy to see how things can maybe slip through the cracks. I would actually love to sit down with one of the devs or the designers and just kind of talk shop with them about this, but I digress. Anyway, that's it for this one. So let me know what you think about Anti-Venom here in the comments below. Is he too powerful? Does he need more utility? Does he need a Snickers? And don't forget to hit that like button, sub if you want some more delicious MCOC content from me. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time.